You write a lot about the history of the whole movement, and there's one person I noticed, is it Hewlett?
John Hewlett.
John Hewlett. Sort of that person seemed to have been a pivotal figure, that he went from a civil rights sort of activist. He was integral in creating one of the first organizations that protested, not protested, went to the to register for the vote, was turned away, but later on he becomes a political boss, and seems to have been as negative in the final say as he was positive in the beginning. It seems like a fascinating character to build a story on, because you see this big arc of a character that doesn't go at all the way you think it's going to go.
Yeah, you know, and John Hewlett is really a central figure in the history and in the story. And one of the, you asked earlier about going down and sort of doing ethnographic history and doing these oral interviews. You know, as a training in graduate school, you're always taught to prepare before you have an interview. And when I had moved down to Alabama and was doing sort of archival research, you know, I finally said, okay, now's the time for me to head on into Lowndes County, which is just west of Montgomery. And so I said, I have to get a feel for the place. If I'm going to write about the place, not just the history, I have to get a feel for the place, see where things are, where are trees, what does the courthouse feel like and look like. And so I head into the county, and I'm just sort of walking around in sort of jeans and a T-shirt, and I'm walking through the county courthouse, and a lady stops me. And she says, this is near the end of late 90s. She says, you know, nice Southern hospitality, you know, how you doing? You know, what's going on? Can I help you? And I said, oh, I'm just here doing a little research on the civil rights movement. And she said, oh, are you familiar with John Hewlett? And I said, yeah, but, you know, whatever happened to him? I thought did he die sometime, you know, a while ago? I was like, oh, no, he's a probate judge. In fact, he's right next door. Let me call, and you can go over and interview him. Now, for me, I'm like, oh, my goodness, this is wonderful, but at the same time, I'm absolutely horrified. Because where are my notes? You know, where's the preparation? I didn't have any time to do that. And so I went over, and he turned out to be a really gracious individual and a fantastic resource. But I didn't know what happened in writing this story. You don't always know in writing history what happens in the end. And I didn't know what happened to the independent political party, to people like John Hewlett as they became involved in the movement after sort of the heyday of the movement. And one of the things that I found is that although they created this radically independent, radically democratic moment of political possibility in the 60s, by the time we get to after the 70s, into the 80s and the 90s, we find a replication, a shift away from those democratic politics towards more traditional American politics. And so there is an arc in the story about challenging power, trying to create a new democratic political practice, and then once people are actually in power, what are the forces that wind up pulling them in different directions, away from what I call in the book freedom politics and towards more traditional American politics. So in that sense, it becomes a little disappointing, but there are lessons to be learned in that, and I try to pull them out.
Has John Hewlett read the book? Has he responded to it, or what do you
No,
think?
well, that's a part of the delicate dance. Unfortunately, he passed away 3 years ago in 2006. But we had some discussions towards the end about it. And I said, you know, listen, this is what people are saying, and this is how people feel. I mean, it wasn't a big secret. You know, he said, listen, you know, I do what I have to do. Now that I'm in office, and, you know, it's just politics. Politics is politics. But the sad thing is, when they got into it, it wasn't because politics were politics. It was because they were trying to create something different, trying to really open up democracy. And so part of the story is, how do people move away from that, that moment of democratic possibility?
Viola Liuzzo, I'm not pronouncing that right.
Liuzzo.
Was a white woman from Detroit who traveled to Alabama for the Selma March and ended up being murdered by the Ku Klux Klan because she was helping move, she was driving at least one protester from Selma to Montgomery, or the other way around. Her murder was influential in gaining support for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Since she was murdered in Lowndes County, how did it influence the situation in Lowndes? And I'm curious, are there monuments there today, or what's the repercussion to that besides the Voting Rights Act?
Well, a couple things. One, there is a marker at the place where she was murdered, and unfortunately, every couple of years it gets desecrated by some folk who are sort of hostile to sort of the memory of the history of the civil rights movement. So now there's a iron fence around it to sort of protect it as sort of a sacred space. But in the moment, there's a bit of historical irony, because it just so happens that she was in Lowndes County. She wasn't working there. She was working really with the Selma to Montgomery March, but really was reflective of how violent, in a way, the situation was for anybody who was engaged in sort of civil rights activism. You know, once she's murdered, although she wasn't there, the movement had already started. People look at that and say, you know what, it can happen to her. It can happen to any of us. That was one thing. But the other thing that plays out that's central to sort of the Layuzo story in Lowndes County is that her trial. Eventually, those who committed the murder are caught very quickly, and they're put on trial in Lowndes County. But an all-white jury, as happens so often in the history throughout the South, an all-white jury refused to convict them. And so there were several, refused to convict the perpetrators. So there were several trials, and eventually in a federal court, they are convicted. But it speaks to sort of that struggle. And then eventually, one of the things that comes out of the Lowndes movement is this effort to get integrated juries. One of the court cases in Alabama, one of the ways white supremacy was maintained was by having all-white juries. And you couldn't get a conviction for anybody who was challenging white supremacy because of these all-white juries. Eventually, a Layuzo jury is seated that's integrated, that has African-American jurors in 1966. But even the African-American jurors who were selected, all people who were active in the movement were not allowed to sit on the jury. But those African-Americans who were selected refused to convict. And afterwards, in the interviews afterward, even the prosecutor said, well, I knew that was going to happen, because they understood what the repercussions would be for themselves if they convicted these white men for killing this white woman who was supportive of the movement.
Being from Brooklyn, did you have a sense of, when you were down there, that, I'm curious, the people thought you were there just to sort of agitate it from the outside again? Because as you're describing all this stuff, all of the formation of the juries and everything, it's all very local kinds of things. It has to go to a federal level to get something else. But you know, you're going to represent as you know, very much an outsider, and coming in. Was that something that you also had to be sensitive to, or you had problems with?
No, I did, and more so on the white side than on the African American side. I mean, the archivists and those who sort of collect history were very open and welcoming. You know, I spent countless days in the state archives, and it was a wonderful place with great people. But when you got into the county, and really started to talk to people, particularly on the white side, there was a real hesitance, a real reluctance, and to a certain extent, a real resentment for dredging up the past. These were things that happened in the past. It was difficult history. Let's move on. Those were the progressives. Some of the non-progressives were, listen, we were right. It's unfortunate that this thing played out the way it did, but you're the last person in the world that I want to talk to about this. But on the African American side, it was just the opposite. And it was again, it was that enthusiasm for somebody to really capture this perspective and to write a story about the people on the ground, not just the outside organizers.
Have you gotten responses from the people that you interviewed? Did you show them the drafts or just the end result? And I'm curious about kind of responses you got then, if you saw that same sort of dual nature being reflected by the same populations.
To a certain extent, yes. One of the things that happened is some of the early drafts with people who I were interviewing, who were very helpful in sending me to different people to interview. You got to have that access. You know, you get the name, somebody refers you to somebody else. Is that suddenly drafts started circulating in the community. And I would get emails from people saying, "Oh, you know, you
independent of your distribution." They
started
independent
of my exactly.
So they copied it off and they sent it to somebody else.
Yeah, it was just sort of this underground thing happening, you know, and which I thought was fantastic because people were engaging in what I had written, and almost across the board. I mean, people were those who took the time to sit down and read it, and different aspects of it, and send me an email or give me a phone call were overwhelmingly positive.